It's amazing how out of practice I can feel just after 5 days. Today's Tuesday, what does that say? The 5th of May, 2026, 5:12 p.m. Happy Cinco de Mayo, my dude. You know what I'm saying? I don't really have anything particular to say, but that's never stopped me before. I'm sitting in the back of my car, actually using my bed platform as a little table to hold my beer, which is actually pretty nice. You know, I gotta say, it's a pretty over-designed beer holder, but in this moment, I'm pretty satisfied and happy with its ability to do what I want it to, which is to hold my beer. So, I just got back from a bike ride recently. I found what I thought was a pretty decent pair of sunglasses, but it kind of turns out that they're just like Walmart brand. They're Foster Grant Ironman Cat 3 sunglasses. I think the model number was AH1026 or something like that. I thought I had found something that was like an expensive item, which is always like a little bit exciting just because, you know, in a certain sense, it's kind of like finding cash. If you find something objectively valuable that's not necessarily cash, it's like a little bit of a boost of excitement just for the sheer fact that, you know, one man's misfortune is another man's fortune. But yeah, so kind of reeling from the bike ride, which was nothing too crazy. I went up to, I think, what was it called? Sky Valley. I always kind of forget what the landmarks around here are named, even though I know them pretty well. I think it was Sky Valley. Anyway, yeah, a big climb. It was just like, I don't know, 700 feet or so, maybe. Certainly not all the way. And honestly, I feel a little, not like out of shape, but like a little bit out of form with my bike riding. Like, you know, I was off the bike for like a month and a half, so I feel like maybe I'm not quite as limber as like I would otherwise be if I was biking with the same kind of schedule that I had been prior to getting on the trail. So all that's fine, but you know, my lower back feels like it fatigues more quickly if I'm sitting down, and I feel like when I'm standing, it feels like I don't quite have the same kind of stamina that I feel like I should have, sort of like a phantom limb syndrome or something like that. But yeah, in any case, it's all good. It's part of the fun. If it felt the same all the time, it probably would be boring. But yeah, dang, you know, I don't even know what to say. I just had a thought, which is perhaps a little unfortunate for those who are listening. But you know, I guess it was just about a year ago that I decided that I would make a podcast and broadcast what I was planning on doing with my life for sort of an indefinite period of time, you know? And so I remember at the time I bought a 1-year subscription to the hosting service that I use, Podbean, and I'm not in this moment entirely sure I will renew that. You know, it's kind of unfortunate because having a hosting platform also allows me to be able to have my podcast live somewhere, but I also have access to other things that I can put stuff on so that it can still live somewhere for free. So now I'm thinking about that because I'm just like, well, if I start getting into this mode where I feel an obligation to make this podcast, but also feel like I have nothing to say, not to say that I don't have anything to say, but if I'm content enough to make my own clips to myself throughout the course of the day, and maybe not necessarily want to share those widely, you know, I feel like that's something I might consider, especially given that I think that the subscription for the hosting service or whatever is like, it was at least a couple $100, I think. Maybe it was less than that. I don't remember. How much might it have been? This is certainly bad podcast fodder, but I'm curious, and this is my whole point. if I was making a clip to myself, I would just like, not even worry about it, my dude, as they say. And so I guess I'm going to need to go all the way back to June-ish. Why do I have these things? Receipt from July 1st. That was $108. That's not crazy. And I guess I actually have from July until July. So July 18th, 2025 until July 18th, 2026. I am boring myself. What is there interesting to say about today? Well, the only thing that comes to mind that I feel like I could riff on, especially as this two-hearted IPA starts to take effect, is that a friend of mine sent me a clip today that had to do with AI, go figure. And it's kind of interesting when people do send me things about AI. It's not... Historically, it hasn't been things that what should I feel like there's a plethora of information about AI, which is like purely like human reaction videos to AI, to different like parts of it, where people are just kind of saying something, but they're not necessarily offering any kind of countermeasure or alternative. And that was kind of a big thing for me today. My dad is weed whacking in the background. But a lot of time when people are, let's say, not even complaining, but let's just say they're airing grievances about the way that something is or the state of something, I take that into account, and I understand that it's fun to complain. One of my favorite things to do with girlfriends is to drink and complain. I feel like it's an area where like you're not actually trying to fix anything, you're just enjoying the fact that like your displeasure is shared with another, which perhaps is actually part of the larger thing that I'm talking about here. But like, it's interesting to me that someone could make an internet persona, and I actually don't know what the full qualifications of this person who I was sent a clip of are. Which I guess, for good due diligence, I already looked him up earlier today, if I remember his name correctly. I think it was Thomas Leahy. Ooh, that's not looking right. It was something Leahy. I knew his last name was Leahy. Let's see if I can do it. Leahy AI. Connor Leahy. Okay. So who is Mr. Connor? Let's find out. He is a German-American artificial intelligence researcher and entrepreneur known for co-founding, that's quite a word there, Eleuther AI, Eleuther AI, and being CEO of AI safety research company Conjecture. He has warned of the existential risk from artificial general intelligence and also has called for regulation such as a moratorium on frontier AI runs, implemented through a cap on compute. That's interesting. I already am more interested. Yeah, the devil's definitely in the details with Mr. Leahy. Yeah, well now I'm actually more interested in hearing more of his takes on everything. I've seen his face a lot on YouTube and stuff like that, and I think he even listened to an interview that he gave at some point without kind of realizing that it was him doing it. It was like my first introduction to him, I suppose. But he was talking about how, generally speaking, human population is declining in industrialized countries. And he had a few quippy lines like, do you know how much you have to harm a mammal in order to stop it from reproducing? And, listening to, and I guess, to be fair, he was like a contributor to a certain kind of roundtable discussion with people, and probably most likely needing to give the most, emotionally resonant sound clips that he could possibly muster in order to make his contributions interesting to where people would actually sit down and listen to them. Because, it takes me a little bit longer for my eyes to glaze over when I'm listening to someone like Andrej Karpathy go over the very technical minutia of how these things actually work. Like, he's got an amazing YouTube series about basically building a GPT from scratch, and they're like, each episode is like 3 hours long. There's like maybe 10 plus of them, and I can usually get through about 45 minutes before there are so many new concepts and so many new vocabulary words where I can't really track what he's saying anymore. Obviously, practice makes perfect, and the more I listen to it, the more one single piece will fall into place in that listening that wasn't solidified before. But in any case, I find it to be a little bit dissatisfying because of the same kind of effect of eating candy or scrolling social media. Like, if you're listening to someone talk about something as complicated and as broad-reaching as artificial intelligence, if you're really just focusing on one negative attribute, and there's certainly a host of negative attributes, without suggesting what the solution would be. I guess what his suggestion is putting a cap on compute, and then also a moratorium to pause development. But that doesn't, in my mind, seem like something that is actually feasible to be done. I don't really subscribe necessarily to the whole economic arms race that we have with China about discovering or creating artificial superintelligence or artificial generalized intelligence. But for sure, in a very real research way, I just don't think that a country like China that is so focused on when China puts its mind to something, it seems like it accomplishes it, if only through brute force. That's always an option that's on the table. If they need to completely destroy a town in order to put a hydroelectric dam for a power center or for a power plant to fuel a data center, that can go through, I'm sure, with one single fiat. Fiat, is that the right word? It's not a fiat. What is it when you're one government official who has the right ranking could make that happen immediately. And that same kind of situation could take years in the United States, Which is interesting to think about, because if China, China is definitely pursuing the level of infrastructure and software design. Is it even right to call it software design? Maybe I should say engineering that we have here in America. There are a lot of people who try to kind of put numbers to how far behind China is in replicating what the frontier AI labs here in the United States have created. And I can't see China joining that kind of a moratorium. And so, again, as someone who thinks that countries and identity politics and racial considerations, nationalism, jingoism, I don't really factor those into the way that I personally look at these kinds of issues, or at least I try not to. I might be doing it unconsciously, but hey, how can I even help that? You know what I'm saying? But the point basically is if AI is really an existential threat and it's something that requires regulation and moratoriums and capping compute, then it's ineffective to do that unless everyone agrees. And getting a country that has very different business ethics, cultural norms, and just basically isn't on board necessarily with the things that we consider to be defaults or things that we might take for granted. It just seems that doesn't actually solve anything. And then, if I wanted to be sensationalist, I would say that then if you did do a moratorium, quote unquote, you would basically be taking the potential ability of this technology out of the hands of like the good guys. And I can't heavily emphasize enough that I am being not even sarcastic, but like, I don't even know. Like, you got to think, there's a lot of self-loathing in modern America, And I think I used to subscribe to that too, when I was more so like forming my identity, which, take it or leave it, this is what I've got to this point. But when I was like a teenager, I was certainly someone who thought that America was like a wicked country that had done unspeakable evils that were unforgivable, and if left unchecked would lead to like a weird kind of global domination from evil powers, basically. And this is like me. I remember vividly like precursors to podcasts, like listening to Jello Biafra and Henry Rollins, and were there even many more? Like, I mean, George Carlin for sure, but like listening to all these spoken word records, and then also comedy specials. And George Carlin's pretty incisive. I would say that like what's the level of his like social critique power? I'm not sure. He definitely inspired me to view things in a way that was sort of like off the beaten path. Like, his idea about not wearing logos on your shirts because they're not paying you to advertise for them. So you shouldn't pay them. You shouldn't pay to advertise for free. That's crazy. But yeah, like I was definitely of a mind that America was like bad. And I think I've been disabused of that notion in the more recent past, because ultimately, first of all, I don't think that it's fair to judge the history of a nation. Ooh, this is getting already complicated. I think it's problematic if you use like modern morals and ethics to judge the actions of a nation in the past when things were different. I personally believe that like morals and ethics are something that are additive over time. I don't think that humanity as a species has had the ability to have profound moral clarity from the beginning. I think it's been something that is iterative and evolutionary. Like, and the way that I frame that in my mind to prove it to my own satisfaction is that like, okay, so my hypothesis is that morals as they exist in 2026 didn't exist and were not accessible to human beings prior to this moment, because it took a bunch of iterative moments of having different beliefs about the internal worth. There's my dad. What's up, Dad? Shout out to my dad. All right. Back from the brink, and you didn't even know I left. But yeah, basically what I'm saying is just like, women didn't get the right to vote until like 100 years ago, and that's like an insane concept to think about. It's insane to think about if you view morality as something that is always like accessible and in the same state, no matter what period of time you exist in. Like, I think that it took time for people to realize the fact that women should be able to vote because of the way that morality evolved from like caveman days all the way to the present, Similarly with slavery and just like any kind of thing actually that just devalues one group of people because of something that they had absolutely no part in requesting they be a part of. Like, people, we don't get to choose if we're men or women, if we're black or white, if we're, I guess you can change your religion at another time, but typically you're born into whatever belief system is like local to the area where you're born. Go figure. And so, all that to say, especially like watching this recent show with my dad that is about like the frontiersmen of America, I go back to that, like the idea of like, well, what was the alternative? Like, if you had in the mid 1800s, like what would be considered then extremely radical beliefs about human value and worth, you would be in an environment that would not allow those beliefs to flourish. You would either be labeled as someone who was like insane, or possibly even killed for having such radical beliefs. I saw the local production of Fiddler on the Roof recently, and the first song in that play, I actually don't know the name of it, but the like chorus, if you will, or maybe the refrain, is that they all just kind of say tradition, tradition, and they're like going over like the traditional mores that rule their society. And tradition is hard to kill, and it's slow to evolve, And so all that just to say, like, I feel like in more recent years of my life, past decade or so, I've just come to the conclusion that, like, most people are doing the best that they can with the tools that they have. And that also applies to like a global perspective, and one that is also bound in time and evolution through time, culturally, socially, etc. And so I just decided that, like, basically not liking America because of like a modern judgment of historical actions retroactively doesn't seem helpful. And as I learn more about history, it also doesn't necessarily seem true. Because the interesting thing is, democracy, American democracy, has existed, for what, 1776, what is that, 1819, 250 years? I think we're about to have our 250-year anniversary. And so, people, like, voted for things to happen. Like, I don't know, I don't know if the Indian Removal Act that Andrew Jackson put into place was actually something that was voted for. I assume that there must have been some sort of thing, unless it was like what do they call that, executive order, but I'm not entirely sure. I have a woefully underdeveloped, oh thank you, denatured alcohol. I'll put some in my beer. Yeah. What am I saying? I swear, shout out to my parents, but I feel like despite my greatest efforts to become invisible, I can find no corners in which to hide myself on this property. Respectfully. Love you guys. It's all good. It's comical to me. Seems like a Three Stooges bit. But yeah, so yeah, not helpful, not even necessarily true. And so, I don't really view the world through the lens of like good guys and bad guys, but I think that there's something important to feel a certain level of, I guess at a minimum, belonging, or maybe connection, or maybe community with the people who you share a country with. Like, if your default is that everything that America does is by definition bad, then that's a really unfortunate thing to do. If that's an unfortunate place to be, if you are also American, And so rather than spending like cognitive load on wondering whether or not like that is the case, I just kind of chalk it up to like, being a human being is messy. When there's a bunch of human beings trying to collaborate, the mess grows ever still. And so the same kind of mess is probably present any place human beings are present. It's sort of unavoidable. Ouch. I can. There's no sanctuary. So what's my point? My point is basically, like, if you consider the country that you're a part of villainous, and you are a member of that country, it probably makes you feel conflicted about your own status and stature, I suppose. And I just take it for a given. It's like, this is the situation I'm in. Didn't ask to be here. As Stewie Griffin says, you know, uh, God delivered this package and I signed for it. And so I'm just like, okay, well, how do you move forward? I'm only interested in like acknowledging things and moving forward. I think that that's an interesting psychological point that I've heard. There was actually recently a new episode of the Andrew Huberman show. Y'all know my affinity for it. And it featured Paul Conti, my favorite person who's ever been on the Andrew Huberman show. And he has a new book. I think it's called What's Going Right. And I just can't help but look at the world through that lens when it comes to trying to make a fair, not even judgment, but just, I don't know, to view it on its own terms without getting too lost in the weeds of like the emotional parts of information, I guess. But like the thesis of the book is like, pathology is only made worse by like identifying with it as like a primary part of your identity. And if you actually look at like what's going right in your life, there's probably more things that are on the good side of the ledger than are on the bad side. But our brains, because of the way that we evolved, if you take that to be the way that it happened, we over prioritize negative experiences with enormous gravity and make them disproportionately important and explanatory for the way that we feel based on the information that we receive. And I've said it before, but I did also think about it while I was biking, like just that concept of like the things that you feel most strongly about are probably the least likely to be true in objective reality. And I don't think that that's a disempowering realization to make. I feel like that's actually the most empowering thing that there is, because in that realization there's a lot of room for empathy, because you realize that the things that other people would become passionate about that might be contrary to your sensibilities, it's not actually a threat against anything that you feel or believe, because it's just them with their life experience expressing how they feel based on everything that they've gone through. And you're doing the exact same thing. And fundamentally, neither one of them is like a threat to the other, but it feels like it is, but it's not helpful to become incensed and let emotions overtake you in a way that you become anger personified or spite personified or sarcasm personified. Like, to me, when I feel those things happening in my own body, as I've mentioned before, there's like a little alarm bell that goes off, and it is a recognition that I am slipping into solipsism. Really, you talk about echo chambers, Like, if you're really, really upset by something that someone else is saying, that's actually an indication that your ego is overly invested in the identity that is opposite to what someone is telling you, rather than just taking it as an interesting piece of information or just a neutral piece of information. Like one of my thoughts that I have somewhat regularly is like, what are the chances that if I went up to somebody and told them something about how I believed that they were incorrect about something that they believed, what are the chances that on this specific day, with the specific word choices that I chose, and the delivery that I, expressed them with, what are the chances that I would change their mind? And I gotta think, in general, the chances are virtually zero. And so it's a lost cause and a foregone conclusion. Like, I don't know how you change hearts and minds, but it's certainly not by arguing. Maybe that used to work. I don't know. I watched these documentaries about history recently, and I'm like, how did someone like Andrew Jackson convince, any group of people of anything before an age of like mass media and social media and stuff like that? How did you convince people that you were right. Like, and, it's probably arguments from authority, probably some class things involved there, like just literally like a very visible hierarchy, like he's like the president of the United States at a certain point. So, you believe your president, or maybe you disbelieve your president at your own peril. And so, like, what am I saying? What's the overall point? Let's bring this into the station, because 30 minutes is definitely enough. My point is, I prefer, if you're going to complain about something, I would happily listen and maybe even contribute to complaining if there was also some sort of reasonable solution that was being proposed. What was the thing I heard today? I watched this thing on Big Think. It was a guy who was talking about the optimized life, and he was describing how to achieve goals. And that would be a pretty reasonable place to leave this, if I can remember what the acronym was for achieving goals. It was something like, I know the word relatable was in it, and time bound. I remember that was part of it as well. And what else? Okay, so yeah, like, I think, if one doesn't want to just purely get lost in belly aching, the difference between rumination on something, about something, and action, this is a good approach to actually do something, provide something that can actually be done, rather than just complaining about stuff. And so, yeah, the SMART goals, where SMART is an acronym, which stands for specific, S. Goals should be narrow and clearly defined to focus efforts. M, measurable. Include concrete criteria, metrics, or indicators to track progress and know when the goal is met. A, achievable/attainable. Objectives should be realistic and possible to complete given available skills, resources, and time. R, relevant/realistic. Goals should align with broader long-term objectives or core needs. And then T, time-bound. To set a specific deadline or target date for completion to create urgency. Yeah, I think that's important. I think there's a lot to consider nowadays, and there probably always has been, but there's a huge difference between rumination and action. I don't know if action is the opposite of, well, it just reminds me of like dealing with your feelings. Like there's a stark difference between rumination and dealing with feelings. Paul Conti talks about having a client come in, they have a really good session, and the client leaves and says, "Man, that was so great. Like I've been thinking about this. I've been dealing with this problem for 10 years, and I feel like I have so much more clarity now." And Paul Conti would say, "Well, you haven't been dealing with this. You've just been ruminating on this. Like you haven't introduced any means of resolution. You've only been thinking on the problem over and over and over again, which is just like a version, I guess, of catastrophizing." And that, to me, I've spent some period of my life doing that, catastrophizing, mostly with like health-related concerns. And the interesting thing about my own experience doing that is that I've been 100% wrong with all of my catastrophizing about my own health to this point. The unfortunate part about being a hypochondriac is that your worries are eventually, if you live long enough, confirmed, in one way or another. Something, unless AI saves us, something will eventually befall me that confirms every concern I've ever had in my life. Which is why it's an interesting thing to be preoccupied with, because until that day, basically all of my worries are weightless and worthless. They have I have been able to harness them in a way that, beers notwithstanding, I can still kind of try to improve my standing, by certain actions like exercise and a generally good diet, and also, as much as I can, a generally good outlook mentally. But ultimately, life is temporary, and, at this point, currently, it eventually stops. So, I don't know. Joni Mitchell comes to mind. She talks about how, she does her work, and then the artists retreat to their quarters to take their powders and potions to get them through this passion play. And I feel like Notebook LM might make the title of this something along those lines. But yeah, I guess what's my suggestion if I'm gonna take my own advice, and what would I say to that guy, Thomas? I already found out it wasn't Thomas. Connor. What would I say to Connor Leahy if we were having a conversation about this, and it was strictly based on the point that he made in the video that I was sent? Well, my thoughts when that initially happened was that we have like a bunch of mathematical formulas to determine the carrying capacity of creatures in a given area. And I gotta think that like the relative abundance that we have procured to this point has an effect on our population size, such that it should actually possibly be expected when things like shelter, food, medicine, things like that are part of a general society and culture. The impetus for reproduction goes down because the pressure, the biological pressure to overcome like infant mortality and just general mortality, there's less pressure there. And so naturally, if nature bends towards homeostasis, then we should expect to see a population stagnate and then possibly decline as a reaction to those types of acquirements. So rather than it being a harbinger of some sort of collapse, it seems like to me in this moment, based on the pitiful amount of information that I actually possess, that's actually an indication that things are getting better. Because do you need 16 billion human beings if, and I don't mean this in a strictly human context, but if you think about endangered species, there's a certain point where an endangered species is taken off the list if it has a comeback, and humanity has had a comeback in the past 200 years from a lot of the factors that were limiting our growth and expansion in life, and that's only an indication that the paradigm is changing. It's not an indication necessarily that the paradigm is collapsing or falling apart or breaking. It's new data, it's a new paradigm, and the past really isn't necessarily an indication of how things should be going or where they will go. So, yeah, before I get too tongue-tied, I'll leave it there for now. And you know what? For good old-fashioned sake, shout out to my parents, love you, bye.